Hello and welcome to today's webinar, SharePoint, Determine Your Next Move. I'm Alison Jersky from AIIM, and AIIM is your host and producer of today's event. With me today is AIIM's Chief Analyst, Bob Larrabee. Also with us are Barry Jinks of Collegial and Mike Alsop from Gimel. Collegial and Gimel are the underwriters of today's webinar. We thank them for their support. And thank you for taking the time to join us today. Before we get started, let me give you some pointers for viewing today's webinar. By joining our webinars live, you can customize your own viewing experience. Feel free to open, close, or resize the different windows. Across the bottom of your screen is the list of all the widgets available to you. You can download a PDF of the presentation at any time. Just look to the resources list. There are also a few other documents and links in there to help you learn more about today's topic. Feel free to ask questions throughout the hour using the Q&A feature. We will hold them until the end, where we should have about 5 to 10 minutes to answer them. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted to AIIM.org's Resources Webinars page in a few days. Now, to introduce today's speakers. Bob Larrabee is the Vice President and Chief Analyst of Market Intelligence at AIIM. Bob is an expert in the application of advanced technologies and process improvement to solve business problems and enhance business operations. With over 30 years of industry experience, including product management, R&D, marketing, sales, and education, his passion is to share his knowledge and experience with organizations seeking to improve their operations, embrace technology, and drive their business forward. Barry Jinks is the founder and CEO of Collegial and has been a technology innovator and entrepreneur for over 25 years. Since the company's inception, Barry has built a solid partnership with Microsoft's SharePoint team and has led his company to develop the most tightly integrated SharePoint data sync solutions available on the market. Barry is a recognized expert on how to balance user productivity with information governance, having consulted with enterprises and government agencies all over the world. Mike Alsop is a Senior Vice President and the founder of Gimel. Gimel develops solutions for content governance and records management products inside SharePoint that have been recognized by Gartner and Forrester as industry-leading. He has also completed 2 terms on the AIIM International Board of Directors. So now to turn things over to Bob Larrabee to begin today's discussion. Bob?
Thanks, Allison. It's great to be here today, and thanks to Barry and Mike for joining us, and of course all of you folks from around the globe that are sitting in listening. SharePoint, absolutely a hot topic these days, and this particular seminar we've focused on or around the recent AIIM Industry Watch on SharePoint. In particular, looking at how SharePoint is being used, some of the challenges, some of the ways that people are dealing with it, some of the elements related to SharePoint 2016. And one of the things that we found in this particular survey, just to kind of set the tone for where a lot of this comes from, a lot of the folks that we talked to are still on 2010 and 2013. Only about 2%, I guess, actually had 2016 installed and running at this point in time. But there is a lot of interest in 2016. And so, as I mentioned, this is all focused around the recent survey. And when we looked at things like organizational use, we asked a very simple question. In your view, describe the use of SharePoint as an ECM, content management or document management system across the organization. 28% of the people that we talked to said SharePoint is their only or their main ECM or document management system, and 13% say that it's extremely, or I should say important, for their overall ECM or document management environment. So looking at SharePoint as a key element within that information ecosystem, if you will. And when we looked at SharePoint 2016, and we asked the question quite simply, if you're planning to move to 2016, SharePoint 2016, what's the primary driver? 15% of the folks that we talked to said they see this as part of a strategic platform vision. So they're positioning SharePoint as a platform. 14% say that they're following an update path, and 11% basically they're following the Microsoft roadmap. So they see this as, from a strategic standpoint, as a foundation to build upon, if you will. Only 8% of the folks that we talked to said they're actually resisting a move to SharePoint 2016. So the indication here, of course, is that a lot of organizations see a role or an important role in relation to SharePoint within their information ecosystem and their infrastructure. So at this point, what I want to do is kind of turn it over, and I'm going to start with you, Barry. In relation to what the statistics I just presented, what are you seeing?
Thanks, Bob, and thanks for everybody for attending today. What we're seeing is, I guess I would almost say, a renewed, heightened interest in SharePoint from the customers out there, particularly because of the options that Microsoft is providing, both for online and on-prem. There really is almost a renaissance, if you will, going on that I can see out there. And it doesn't surprise me that there's still a lot of companies on 2010, 2013. Takes a lot to move a large organization to a new technology platform. But yeah, we're seeing a tremendous number of customers that are interested in the product, using it in a variety of different ways, from document management to records management to file sharing to managing business processes. So yeah, it's I think SharePoint is really on a good roll right now.
Okay. Mike, you seeing something similar, or are you seeing things a little bit differently than what Barry just described?
Basically, we're seeing the same things that Barry is seeing. I see a fair amount of confusion in the market. There are an awful lot of companies of different sizes that have made some investment in SharePoint. What we're seeing, among other things, is that the largest organizations, the Fortune 100, seem to be the most aggressive in moving forward with SharePoint, especially SharePoint Online within Office 365. Office 365 is seen as really a prominent path to the cloud. Most of these organizations have long histories with Microsoft Office, and this is the Microsoft path. We're seeing a lot of emphasis, more emphasis than we'd seen in prior generations of SharePoint in out of the box, but we're seeing a lot of confusion as to what out of the box means. There's also a lot of confusion about how investments that organizations have made in SharePoint solutions that were on-premise can be migrated into the newer SharePoint app or SharePoint framework models that Microsoft is promoting. There's a ton of interest, and we're seeing payloads moved one at a time into Office 365, in many cases starting with email and then following with SharePoint Online.
Mm-hmm. It really is a kind of an interesting thing. And when we talk about, you were talking about some confusion and so on, in some organizations at least anyway. And one of the things that we did ask about, in relation to scope and development of SharePoint, is how organizations, the respondents, would describe their success or progress. 7% indicate that they had complete success. In other words, they reached their goals, they met their expectations. 26% of the folks that we talked to said they're struggling to meet the original expectations, and 20% say that progress has actually stalled in relation to what they're trying to do. When we dug a little bit deeper and we asked, why do you feel that your project has stalled or failed? 67% said that inadequate user training. They feel that there's not enough training in the user community for SharePoint. 66% say that it's too hard to use, and 64% say it's a lack of senior management support. It's basically, the message came down from on high, thou shalt use SharePoint, and they put it in, but that's pretty much as far as it went. They didn't train the users. They didn't senior management. It was basically kind of a lip service thing that said we're going to do this, but didn't really stand by it, is the indication that we saw. And so we did ask, well, since you're saying that you're stalled or your project is failing, what kind of steps are you going to take to re-energize that deployment? What are you going to do to get things back on track? 58% said they're going to prioritize internal training, which makes perfect sense. If the users are saying we don't know how to use it, there's inadequate training, then yeah, we have to figure out a way to do that. But 50% said that they're going to update and enforce IG policies, information governance policies. And this is something that I hear a lot, is that when it comes to SharePoint, there's not really a lot of governance or guidance over who should use it, how should use it, and policies and procedures around it. And 35% said they're basically going to go back and confirm that SharePoint is their primary ECM system. This gets back to, or ties back to, that lack of senior management support, where it's basically saying, yeah, we're going to use SharePoint, but are we really going to do that? And so, Mike, I'm going to start with you this time. In relation to these things, projects failing, how organizations are trying to get things back on track, what are you seeing?
So what I've seen mainly is that people jump into SharePoint with too much optimism and not enough architecture and planning, so that they end up starting with SharePoint, building some sites, and wondering why it didn't work so well. I'd go back to Microsoft Word. How many people have been using Word for 20 years and haven't done a lot of training? I believe that an effective SharePoint site should have not a lot of need for training, because the use of it is intuitive and the enforcement of policy is transparent behind the scenes. So you're letting people use sites and not requiring an awful lot of training. Training is important. Change management is particularly important. But what you want is a consistent set of sites with consistent behavior and expectations that users have confirmed on the sites. That only comes from architecture and planning in front of the deployment of those sites.
And Barry, are you seeing along the similar lines where you are, or what are you seeing differently than from what Mike just described?
No, I think we see very similar patterns to what Mike is saying. I'd say the one thing that if I look at the projects that we've been involved in that have been really successful, what you see quite often is a visionary that's leading that. Somebody who has envisioned what they're trying to achieve, as Mike mentions, builds a good architecture to achieve that, and has measurements in place afterwards to understand how they're doing and course correct. But it's often someone who really understands what they're trying to achieve. And I'd say the interesting thing that the study showed, that the second thing that people are going to do, or the second most common thing people are going to do to improve the SharePoint success is put information governance policies in place, and that doesn't seem to be something that you would normally equate with a way to improve a user experience. But the reality is that by building a good governance regime and building a good user experience around that governance regime, you can actually help users to figure out how to use the system better in a way that is conducive to what the organization is trying to accomplish. So I think there's a lot of good stuff that information governance can do as long as it's applied properly.
This brings up an interesting thought in my mind, and it's one that I hear a lot about, and it's the discussion of SharePoint and Microsoft 365. How are we leveraging SharePoint in relation to Office 365? Are customers actually looking to leverage SharePoint through 365, the Microsoft 365 offering? So, Barry, what are your thoughts on that? What are you seeing?
Well, yeah, I mean, totally. companies are moving to an online world. More and more companies are trying to figure out how to leverage Office 365. As Mike had mentioned earlier, they start often with email, and then they'll move to SharePoint somewhere down the road. And there's an interesting opportunity, obviously, to integrate your email with SharePoint and manage email, which is, I think, something you're going to talk about a little later here. But yeah, Office 365 is clearly every customer we're talking to is looking at Office 365 and trying to leverage it in some way, and ultimately see a lot of their information moving there. There are companies that say they'll never move everything there, but I think a lot of companies have a good proportion there already and are planning to move a lot more.
That's similar in your world, Mike, in relation to SharePoint and 365?
Absolutely. Large organizations are very interested in taking advantage of the cloud. Number of people we've worked with have used the cloud as a way to deliver their applications to a global footprint, to collaborate globally. There's a lot of concern about the security, but Microsoft, I think, has made a forceful case that in many cases the security in Office 365 is better than it was on-premise. So we see a movement to Office 365, particularly in the largest organizations.
Right. So one of the things that we hear too, and you hear this regardless, SharePoint, Office 365, Microsoft 365, it's this whole premise of collaboration, right? And the idea of not just, I'm going to say, information sharing in that sense, but collaboration, of course, in relation to engagement, in relation to process, things like review and approval processes. And when we did ask that question, how are you using SharePoint in relation to things like process management and enterprise connection, 24% said they use the enterprise search function very widely across the enterprise. 19% say there's wide use for document review and approval processes, which is kind of, a given, I guess. It makes perfect sense that we could do that. But 72%, and this is an interesting one, said they show no support for mobile device use. And in today's world, that to me is just kind of mind-blowing, because it's mobile device use. You see them everywhere. Everybody's got them. They're all working on them in some way, shape, or form, whether it be just checking email or as part of an integrated part of a process where they can engage in the business activities. And so 72% said they show no support whatsoever for mobile devices. Yet, when we asked about the usefulness of these capabilities, the idea of mobile application of SharePoint, 90% said that it's very important to be able to distribute documents in a controlled way in relation to mobile, right? And 75% said that it's very important to provide intranet capabilities on mobile devices. So while there's no support for it, or the seemingly no support for it, the demand obviously is there, and the benefit is kind of being recognized by these folks. They're saying, yes, this is important for us, to do document distribution in relation to mobile and to have intranet capabilities, yet my organization doesn't support this. And so that to me is a little bit kind of dumbfounding in a sense. Would you say that this is very common in the world that you see, Mike?
So what I'd say is there are some underlying technical elements that make this true. Obviously, mobile is huge, but most organizations have most of their SharePoint deployed in SharePoint 2010 or SharePoint 2013, and most of the access of that SharePoint is through browser-based access. A lot of the world of mobile is going more to an app-based access, and it's really only with some of the new tools that Microsoft has introduced in 2016 or that others have provided that SharePoint becomes as accessible to mobile devices as it's been to desktops, laptops, and browser-based activity. It needs to be responsive for old eyes like mine. It needs to be, you need to have a way for people to focus on it. So it's very important. In mobile access, you have to do a lot more of the governance behind the screen because you have less real estate on your screen that you can work with. There's a lot of progress being made, but it's going to take some movement to some of the more modern versions of SharePoint and Office 365.
Okay. And Barry, what are customers telling you in relation to mobile? I mean, do they have the kind of support? Is that number that far off that, better than 70% say there's no support for it, or are you seeing something different?
Well, I'd agree with Mike that most companies kind of rely on a mobile browser experience to say that they support mobile. But unfortunately, it's not a particularly good experience. And often, if you don't have a connection, you can't get access to your content, which makes it difficult when you're maybe in a connection-challenged area or on a plane or whatever. So we actually, that's kind of what we do, is provide governed access to content on mobile and desktop. So we have a lot of customers that are doing that now, and what we find is the governance tools that that we have are very popular with people to give them the ability to control access to content. And I'm not trying to give a product pitch here, but mainly just talk about kind of use cases that when companies have access to these kinds of tools, they can dramatically increase the productivity of their workforce. A couple of examples, we have a large company that's thousands of salespeople that's distributing sales documentation, and they use the tool to control who gets access on what device. People can then bring their own devices and sort of automatically get that content on the device without having to think about it. But the company is getting reports back on how that's being used, and that's very useful for them. We field service people that are doing the same kind of thing, professional services companies. So there is tools that allow you to do it, but they're pretty new, and a lot of people don't know about them. And as Mike said, it's really kind of a browser world that most people think about. So hopefully that will change.
Still very much, yeah. Still very much browser-centric in the minds and hearts of folks, yeah. This brings up, you were talking about things like governance there in both cases, and how things should work, how they should be presented, upgrading technologies, and so on. And one of the things that comes to mind and into discussion a lot with folks that I talk to is how well or how poorly they feel SharePoint deals with records management. And so one of the questions that we asked in this survey is, how does SharePoint match your records management needs, or does it? And 25% said that they actually don't differentiate records from content. They don't make that distinction from one to another. 21% said that with careful setup, SharePoint can comply to meet their needs. So whatever their records requirement needs are, they can actually get it by configuring and setting up SharePoint properly. 18% of the folks that we talked to said that they do, in fact, use add-on products to enhance the records management capabilities, which, of course, led to the conversation about governance, and governance, of course, being not just the policies, but policies, procedures, tools, and all those things. And so we asked the question, how well aligned is SharePoint to your information governance policies, basically the rules? 21% said they have they don't have any good IG policies in place. 15% say SharePoint aligns really well, but 37% said, they still got a lot of work to do in relation to IG policies. And so the idea of governance, I've heard folks say we've put SharePoint in because we believed it was going to be the be-all, end-all solution, and it really didn't meet our expectations, going back to, stalled projects and things. And it all came down to governance. We put the technology in, but we didn't really have rules and procedures and guidelines in place for it. And so as you talk with your customers and you talk about SharePoint, What kind of conversations take place in relation to governance and records management? Mike, why don't we start with you on this one?
Okay, I'm going to basically say what Barry said on the last point, which is, of course, that's what we do. So we've been working with records management in SharePoint for the last really 8 years, and there's been a huge evolution. Microsoft itself really built SharePoint to support retention management and to support the association of an information policy with each piece of content. And that is an elegant enterprise-scaled foundation, but they really didn't provide the kinds of tools that an enterprise with thousands of SharePoint sites or Office 365 sites would need to be able to manage the information lifecycle. So what we find is that people need those tools in order to really do records management and information governance at an enterprise level. There are a wide variety of companies that provide those tools. It's important to be able to apply that governance to all of the sites. That means that you have to take over the process of provisioning those sites so that they're consistently deployed and that the governance can be transparently applied. We see organizations wrestling with the issues of the different kinds of repositories, whether it's their email repositories or their shared drives or SharePoint or Office 365 or even Box or Dropbox. There's a huge need for governance. We see that reflected in all organizations. When you said at the start 25% don't differentiate records from content, I think that's a modern view. You have to manage the life cycle of all of the content, not just the records. And there's a lot of frustration that in the environment because there's a lot of work that has to take place in order to really set that up.
So kind of a blending of all. It's records are not just records anymore. It's all part of the bigger picture.
Right.
Okay. And Barry, that falls in line with what your customers are telling you? I mean, when you go in and you start talking about SharePoint, and do you get into records discussions, and do they ask you for advice on governance over all of this?
Absolutely. We focus on kind of, if you will, the last mile of governance, just sort of the user interaction and how to get users to follow the policies and how they can apply, and declare records and apply metadata and things in an easy way. So we don't focus on the guts of the records management system like Gimel does. We focus on the user experience around that. And I think what's really interesting is that companies struggle a lot with this because, as we talked about earlier, it's becoming increasingly a mobile world. There's so many stories out there about data loss on devices and how it's uncontrolled, and bring your own device, and how do you control the user experience in a governed way on a mobile device, and that has created some issues for companies. Maybe that's why they shied away from providing mobile capabilities, because they're concerned about governance on mobile devices. But I think there are tools out there today that can allow you to do that, and they're getting more and more mature as time goes on. So there is that possibility and that capability to extend governance and records management to the last mile, as we say.
I'm going to ask a quick and simple question of each of you. This is something that's kind of stuck in my mind. I've asked this question of other folks, clients in the user community, but how often is it that you walk into a organization to work with them on what they're doing, and they actually present you with their governance policies and procedures in relation to information management? How often do you see that, where they actually do have something in place and say, this is what we want SharePoint to support? Barry?
Well, we tend to be more downstream than Gimel would be.
Yeah.
And quite often we get called in once they have decided what the information architecture is going to look like. So quite often they will have that, but often we also get brought into projects where they wouldn't have a necessary another third party in there to be developed in-house. And we find there's a lack of understanding and a lack of planning. And again, as I said earlier, I think the most successful projects are somewhere where you have a visionary and an architect in place that has really thought these things through, and we see projects being very successful when that happens, and not so successful when it doesn't. So I don't know what Gimel's saying, but you guys are farther down.
Mike, are you seeing that? How often, I guess, do you see that, where somebody lays out, here's my governance policies and?
So I guess what I'd say is. There are a wide variety of organizations that we walk into. So let me divide it into sort of big, small, and government. In large organizations, there's absolutely policy, there's retention schedule, there's a lot of thought that's been put into governance. Typically, what we see is that governance started with physical governance, physical records management. It's been applied in Documentum or OpenText or whatever the legacy ECM system that they have. It's been tried to be applied with the same approach to SharePoint, and it's not worked as well. So we see that case. In the smaller organizations, we see a lot less definition. And in governments of really all sizes, we see a lot of effort has been put into compliance and following the rules, but there are just a different set of requirements. So it depends. Everybody has been doing their best to implement governance in the environment in which they live. What we find is that it really helps to have somebody who's done it before if you're trying to apply governance to a tool that's as big and complex as SharePoint or Office 365.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And as you say, breaking it down that way, you can kind of follow along with it. So we asked, because I hear all the time, it's people that I hate SharePoint, I love SharePoint, I'm somewhere in the middle, I'm kind of neutral. So we did ask. And we asked about their feelings, in relation to SharePoint. 40% agree and 8% agreed that they are happy with SharePoint in the ongoing product roadmap. And so, it's not a case of I absolutely hate it, the whole world hates it. It's actually quite different. 42% agree and 8% strongly agreed that SharePoint actually provides good value to the cost for them. And so these are very positive indications. These are folks, I think, that really have a good grasp on what they're trying to do with it. And these are the folks that it's met their expectations. When we asked about strategy for SharePoint, likely strategy, what are you planning to do with this? 29% said that they're going to build their ECM, RM, and collaboration around SharePoint. So using it again, kind of that platform type of mentality that says, we're going to take this tool and we're going to build upon this thing. And 10% actually said that they are planning right now. They're in the planning stages to move to SharePoint 2016. And so this gets back to that whole idea of the roadmap and, updating and kind of following a direction. And so as we kind of get toward the end of things here, a few things that I would like folks to think about, and once I finish this, we'll go through, I'm going to let both Barry and Mike talk a little bit about their companies, then we'll start taking some questions from the audience, and we do have quite a few there. But things to think about, as you're listening to this, as you're thinking about SharePoint for your organizations, if your SharePoint deployment is stalled or it's failing, and you can't see it bringing any new value, then really what you need to do is identify what the reasons are and develop a plan of action to resolve them. What's preventing you from reaching these goals? What is that barrier? A lot of times what happens is it stalls or it starts to go off track, and nobody's really quite sure why. It just kind of happens. And so really you need to dig into it and figure out what's going on there. Develop or refine information governance frameworks, and use this to see where you have gaps, right? And in particular, if you don't actually have an IG policy or framework in place, then this is something that you want to get your arms around. Information management practices as a whole. Because if you don't have any guidelines, if you don't have any structure, certainly technology is going to help from a management standpoint, but how are you managing it? What are you managing it to? And in particular, in relation to if you do differentiate records from the rest of the world, from the rest of content, and the idea of bringing in mobile, what is considered to be appropriate use, and how you're going to protect information in relation to that. And then finally, confirm with your senior management team what role SharePoint actually is going to play in the organization from a strategic standpoint and a tactical standpoint. What exactly are you trying to do with SharePoint? Is it ECM, DM, records management, collaboration? Maybe it's a combination of all three, but you really need to understand what it is you're trying to do with SharePoint and identify some of those business areas that you want to address with it. Is there a specific business problem or a business need? What are the business requirements? And so these are just a few things, kind of takeaways I think that are important from my perspective. So, as we're getting toward the end of this session, and again, I'm going to take some questions very shortly here. We do encourage you to go out there, look at the report, download the report. I know that there's a link also that you can use to download these slides and download some of the resources. Take advantage of that, and go out and gather up all the resources that you can find in relation to this. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Barry. Barry, why don't you tell us a little bit about Collegial? And again, thank you for participating, you and Mike, Collegial and Gimel, as underwriters of this session. And why don't you tell us a little bit about what you guys do?
Well, thanks, Bob, and I appreciate you hosting the session today. You did a great job. Collegial is a company that helps customers to balance end-user productivity and governance. We actually provide tools that on a variety of platforms, from plugins to Microsoft Outlook to mobile tools, and these tools help companies get users onto the platform and support synchronization of information to those devices and presentation and capture of information to SharePoint through a really easy-to-use interface. On the other side, we have a platform built on Windows Azure that helps companies to govern that information, so to manage what information is pushed, what policies are pushed to those devices, to help with the application of metadata, and to prevent data loss on the device and to track user activity, so that you get a complete view of what's happening with the information once it's distributed to a user through a mobile interface or desktop interface. I'd invite people to try the product out. It's very, very easy to get up and operating. In fact, come to our site, collegial.com. We have a 5 for free program that allows customers to get onto the platform, try it out, both the web app side to what we call the console, as well as their choice of apps on Android, iOS, Outlook, Windows, and Mac. So our apps work across pretty well every platform out there. So again, thanks, Bob, and I'll turn it over to Mike to talk about Gimel.
Thanks, Barry. Gimel helps our customers implement digital workplaces that improve business and enable the management of the full life cycle of information. We as a company, have been doing this work for 15 years. We had some very large organizations that we implemented SharePoint-based solutions and found that the problems we were solving in content governance and records management and usability were really the same across organizations, and therefore if we productized the solutions that we built in some of our early clients, we could reuse that. And in discussion with Microsoft and our clients, what we discovered is that there really is a market for that, and people are looking for real support and enterprise scalability. We started with records management. We discovered that people have thousands of sites and need a life cycle and a set of capabilities that would deploy into all of those sites to enable governance, and they needed to have usable, friendly sites, and that got us into the world of site provisioning, self-service provisioning, configuration of sites, consistency of branding, and staying in tune with the capabilities that Microsoft was bringing to market. Now that Office 365 is in the market, there's really a different set of rules for governing content in Office 365 than there were on-premise, and we're helping some of the largest companies in the world establish a life cycle of content, a hybrid life cycle of content across SharePoint and Office 365. A number of our clients use SAP, and so we provide full interoperability of documents in our solutions with transactions in SAP. We work with Barry's company to integrate records management into these solutions. We try to support the full stack of the Microsoft capabilities. I've listed a number there. There's a lot of information that's available to you on gimel.com. In particular, if you go to gimel.com, the records kit, you'll see some of our current thinking on governance and records management and our survival guide. I'd like to thank AIIM. I thought that the work that goes into the 2016 SharePoint report and all of the AIIM reports is a real service to the industry, leveraging the user community that supports AIIM, and we're glad to be a part of it. And Bob, with that, I'm going to transfer it back to you.
Well, thanks, Mike, and thanks for those kind words in both Barry and Mike. It's been a great session. There are some questions out there. Let's see what we got here. There's a common theme, and I'm going to kind of paraphrase this because there's a couple questions out there along the same vein. But basically, it gets back to the kind of learning curve, the end user adoption thing. And people have a tough time training the users. There could be a plethora of reasons why. But basically, the message is, how do I go about, or how do you see the future of SharePoint in relation to addressing the learning curve? Maybe some of the best practices, some of the things that you guys have seen in relation to that, where SharePoint is being put in place, and it's time to teach the users how to use it. So Barry, I guess I'll start with you on that one. What do you see from a futuristic standpoint in dealing with this?
Well, I think it's important to understand the mindset of a typical user, and it makes sense because if you think of yourself, basically people think of they act in their own self-interest pretty well. They think, what's in it for me? And if you try to push some system on them or some platform on them that makes them do extra work or do things that they didn't used to have to do that seem like make work, they're not going to adopt it. So, really you have to think about how to integrate this into the business process that people are used to, that people are happy with, that people want to do, and make it transparent to them. Things like governance, for example, or records management. People just aren't going to fill out a whole bunch of big forms for metadata. They're going to want automatic extraction, and for example, of email properties, and maybe even extraction of other metadata properties. So it makes it easy for them. That kind of thing. So you've got to integrate this into their workflow, and you've got to make it super simple for them. And if they see the benefit, then they'll do it. Particularly for you mentioned one of the things you mentioned was a lot of companies are using SharePoint search, and so people love to find information, discover information. And if they understand that if they get it into the system and they apply some metadata to it, that you can find it later, there's a benefit to the user. So that's also that training and understanding what is the benefit to them, and really pushing that when you're implementing the system and training the users and advertising it around the company. So we've seen those sort of things work well when you go with that mindset.
Okay. You mentioned records management, and this one I'm going to direct to Mike in relation to records management. One of the things that I hear and I'm seeing here as well is basically when it comes to records management in SharePoint, and Barry, you just mentioned, nobody wants to load up all kinds of metadata and take all that amount of time. The users in particular look at it as this is increasing my amount of work, not helping me to decrease it. So Mike, one of the things that I'm seeing here is when you plan a records management solution, what would you say are some considerations to look at it from a back-end standpoint? So instead of the users having to declare records and do all of that work up front, what would you say would be a good approach or certainly considerations in relation to putting that on the back end, to handle maybe it's things like automated classification and handling retention and disposition based on things like document types and so on.
So what I'd say is that when people talk about systems being easy to use, they're really talking about search and tagging most of the time. And when people talk about transparent governance, what they're talking about is tagging and rules, actions, and transparency. So let me elaborate on those a little bit. When you just take SharePoint out of the box and you put up a site, it doesn't really set you up easily to automatically pre-fill the metadata related to a piece of content. That takes thought and architecture. And when people complain about records management, many times what they're complaining about is the need to manually insert the metadata. If you could automatically inherit the metadata based on what today is, who's the user, what the department is, and what the site is you're on, and whatever else that's relevant to that content, you've gone a long way. When you can establish rules based on combinations of metadata without programming, that enables you to go a long way. Auto classification is a great capability. We haven't found it to be enough in and of itself. You have to enhance it with some architecture and some thinking. But if you combine those and plan the provisioning of the sites, you can take an awful lot of what people complain about to enable records management, and as a side benefit, enable much greater search and findability of information in SharePoint sites.
Okay. So I'm going to present, we've got time for one more that I'll pass to you guys before closing it out. But there's, in particular, when you're looking at implementing SharePoint, and I'll say from scratch, because it seems like there's a lot of people out there that are moving in this direction, haven't quite taken that step yet, not quite sure, and I hear this time and again. What would you consider some of the key factors to consider before implementing SharePoint? And Mike, I think I'll start with you on that one.
Key factors before implementing SharePoint: know who your users are, know what you're trying to achieve. I've heard it said the journey of 1,000 miles starts with the first step. You better know what direction you're going before you just start provisioning sites. So make sure you've planned out the journey that you're trying to take with SharePoint.
Okay. And Barry, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that planning is for sure the number one thing. And as I said earlier, visioning, understanding, and envisioning what you are trying to achieve. Being able to build the tools and the capabilities to be able to achieve that, and then measuring and course correcting. It's kind of like almost like it's like a little startup. You're building a product essentially internally, and you have to sort of get it out there and start to see what the reactions are and be agile and be able to modify it, because you're dealing with end users at the end of the day, and it's hard to predict what a large population of end users are going to like and dislike, so you've got to be prepared to be agile and change as you go. I think the other important thing as well is how you communicate it internally. You talked a little bit earlier about having executive support, that the executives need to communicate and support the system and not undermine it. And I think how you communicate is really, really important. So build a good communication plan and get people on board that way, and I think you'll have success. That's projects that we have seen have been the ones where, again, there's been an internal champion that has been great at communicating that and continuing to fight through the tough times, because that's what happens when you build a new product, just like you're building a new SharePoint or Office 365 implementation.
Communication is key across the board, from the top on down and back again. So, well,
yep.
This has been a great session, guys. Thank you all for joining us from around the globe. I'm Bob Larrabee, and I'm here with Barry Jenks of Collegial and Mike Alsop of Gimel Group. We've had a great time sharing our knowledge. I know I have. Sharing some of the stats and listening to you guys both, sharing your experiences, and of course answering some of the questions that some of the folks have presented to us. And as we kind of get close to the closing hour here, I would invite everybody that's out there to take a little bit of time. Go look at the Gimel site, go look at the Collegial site, come to the AIIM site. And in particular, if you're looking for next steps, if you're looking to gain some more knowledge or greater insights, we offer a lot of different training programs at AIIM, so I invite you to come and check that out as well. See what we have to offer. There might be a few programs out there that could be quite beneficial for you. So having said all that, we're getting ready to end this hour, and we have recorded this webinar. It will be made available in the next day or so at AIIM.org in the resources section under webinars. And so if you want to go back and listen to what we've said, or even if you've got some folks that, couldn't make it today, but you want to share this with them, by all means, point them to that recorded session. Don't forget to download the resources in the list to the right of the slide area also. And when this webinar is over, what we're going to do is we're open up a brief survey on your desktop. We do value your feedback, and this is how we make our programs better here at AIIM. So if you could take a few moments just to complete the survey, and if you've got comments or suggestions on topics or ways that we can make this better for you, then by all means, please share that with us. So again, if you could take a moment or two to provide your feedback, we do greatly appreciate that. Again, thank you to Mike Alsop and Barry Jenks of Gimel and Collegial. without your support, and without the support of underwriters like you, these webinars and the things that we do at AIIM really wouldn't be possible. So we do thank you greatly for your support and being a part of AIIM and everything that we do here. And so as we come to the end of the session, what I'm going to do is I'll call on Mike and Barry one more time. Just what I'd like you to do is share with us what you would consider to be a key takeaway, some closing thoughts. What do you want people to remember out of this last, 50, 60 minutes or so that will stick in their minds and they can take back and start using right away? So, Barry, why don't I start with you on that one?
Well, I would just the takeaway I would have for people is, there are a lot of very successful projects, records, compliance, information management projects that are being done on SharePoint and Office 365 today. I'd say try it and use it. As long as you build a good plan, I think you'll be successful with it.
Okay. Mike, some closing thoughts and key points from you?
So Microsoft has continued to deliver on its commitment to make SharePoint on-premise and SharePoint online into an enterprise platform to manage unstructured information. A lot of the innovation that comes in SharePoint 2016 has come from Microsoft learning what it takes to manage very large deployments of SharePoint, and that has resulted in some changes in direction that cause people who've implemented in earlier versions of SharePoint to need to do more work. The goal that Microsoft has, and the point that I'm making, is that they're making an enterprise-scaled platform that addresses the weaknesses that people have rightly pointed out about SharePoint. So it's a path worth continuing on. My second point is the consistent provisioning, the consistent site provisioning of SharePoint sites enables organizations to incorporate the kind of governance that you need in sites, and it's way more expensive to incorporate that governance after the fact. So planning for the kinds of deployment that you're going to make in an organization is really important, and we really believe in the path forward with SharePoint and Office 365. Thanks very much.
Awesome. Great feedback, gentlemen. And again, I thank you for being part of all of this. So at this point, on behalf of AIIM, Allison Jursky, and Gimel with Mike Alsop and Collegial with Barry Jenks, I'm Bob Larrabee. And we thank you for joining us and hope to see you again next time.
Thank you all for attending, and thank you, Bob.